that's your entire almost all of your defensive line is all American. And behind that amazing defensive line, and this is where we really get into why Texas Tech, I think, is equipped to win a national championship. Back in the day when me and Todd McShay worked for Gary Horton. Gary Horton was a scout for the Cleveland Browns. He was like a director of football ops pretty much for Arizona State back when like Frank Kush was the head coach and John Jefferson was a wide receiver there, Danny White when he was a quarterback. And then Gary went to the NFL. He worked for the Bucks, worked for the Browns, and he ultimately worked for a sports agent where he would help guys train for the draft and up their draft status. But Gary had forgotten more about football than I'll ever know because of his proximity to it for such a very long time. God rest his soul. He passed away about 4 years ago. So, but there used to be these reports we would get. And if you've been in NFL circles, you're familiar with the Giddings reports. And this guy Giddings, I don't know who the hell he was, but he would sit in a room and he would grade every player in the NFL. And he would have a synopsis on them. And for whatever reason, this guy, the Giddings guy, was gospel. But one of the things that he said that stuck with me, and I've never seen this change over the course of my consumption of big-time football, whether it's college or the NFL, waves win championships. Now, what's a wave? You probably already know because you're watching the show and you like sports. But basically what it is it's your ability to substitute up front on the offensive and defensive line and to have depth at the two most important units, most football people would say, on the field, right? If you can have depth behind, now we're talking about why Texas Tech is so uniquely qualified to win this title, because we're talking about depth behind All-Americans, right? You have 3 All-Americans on your defensive line, okay? And when you give them a spell, you're coming in with waves of guys who are able to not only hold the rope, right, but dominate at the point of attack, just like the first stringers do. And when you have second teamers who can continue to dominate at the point of attack, so you can keep those guys who are so good fresh against an attack, quite possibly like in Oregon, where you'll see tempo. It's not as though there's not a particular brand of football that Texas Tech's defense that is so wildly talented, right? And so incredibly coached by Sheil Wood. Like, there's not an attack they're going to see that they're not going to be able to stop. And when you think about their offense, it's basically the same formula. Like, you have a 1,000-yard runner in Cameron Dickey who has scored 14 touchdowns. You have Cool Hand Luke at quarterback in the form of Baron Morton. And then you have studs and by the way, Scotty and I are going to talk about the transfer portal at some point. And I don't mean to jump ahead or poach any of Texas Tech's guys, but like, you've got guys that you want to talk about depth. You got like a Micah Hudson at wide receiver, who's a 5-star, one of the best players coming into college football years ago, that hasn't quite found his footing. And honestly, with all the DJ Lagway talk about a possible transfer to Baylor, how amazing would that be if Micah Hudson were to come back home, right? Because he hasn't really been able to, let's say, find a strong foothold in that Texas Tech offensive attack, but he's still there, and he's still a guy that could make a huge play in this college football playoff, as far as I'm concerned. And that's the depth you're talking about. Like, you've got 5 stars now that are adding to the attack. And Texas Tech, as we well know, has just acquired the number 1 recruiting class in the Big 12, right? Like, and close to the number 1 all across college football. Like, underrated points about Texas Tech that you can't necessarily quantify with statistics, okay? But you can quantify with wins. This is a very physical football team. And I think that the country is going to be put on notice in the coming weeks. Again, I mentioned the line of scrimmage. Like, it starts up front. This is a nasty group of guys, right? A nasty group of guys. When I'm looking down at some of the stuff I wrote this morning, Romello Height, okay? I love how he plays what they call the dog position, right? And that is apt because the dude plays like an absolute dog, an absolute dog. And as far as I'm concerned, he's the one guy that was left off the All-American lists, if I'm not mistaken, right? And so that's a guy now who's probably playing pissed off. Another aspect of Texas Tech's attack and the way that this team is comprised that leads me to believe that they will be playing into the middle of January is their red zone efficiency. When Texas Tech gets into the red zone, unless it's against BYU, they score touchdowns. We saw them struggle with field goals in that first game. But in the second game, they certainly seem to have rectified any issue that they would have had there. So your ability to punch it in when you get inside the 20 is a huge part of postseason victories. You can no longer trade field goals or trade touchdowns for field goals if you want to win a championship, right? Especially in the early rounds. And that brings me to my next point, that Texas Tech not only can beat your ass in a phone booth, right? And they can win a street fight or what you would call a rock fight, but they're also wide open, right? Not only because they'll generate turnovers on defense. Jacob Rodriguez, by the way, first-team All-American, created a turnover a game going into that championship game against BYU. One turnover a game. That's one guy. One guy. So you've got a defense that can create havoc and generate turnovers, which can lead to a short field and quick strikes for your offense. But you also have an offense that's wide open. Wide open. And Bear Morton can get down the field, can take the top off against some of these defenses who may not know or will try a bunch of different stuff. I mean, you can't put anything past some of these brilliant coaches, but how are you going to stop them? How are you going to stop them offensively? They have a ton of balance. They can get wide open with you, and they can put it right down your throat behind the big guys and getting it to Cameron Dickey. And let's not forget either, they lost their first-string running back in training camp. That's a huge component of all this that I think sometimes we overlook. And that goes back to my first point about why the next man up mentality and the next man up school of thought really applies to Texas Tech. Because in most situations, when one guy goes down, obviously the quarterback, most important position on the field, you got to keep Bear Morton in bubble wrap, really. You can't let this guy get hurt because that changes the whole game with his backup out for the season. So you've really got to take very good care of Bear Morton. That is essential, right? And a balanced attack will help you do that. But outside of him, the next man up mentality across this team, you can look at that being reflected in Cameron Dickey and his work this year. Another thing that I think is, and I've kind of gone with like intangibles here. Here's an intangible for you. And I don't care how many people have been named All-American on the Texas Tech defense. There is a nobody believes in us mentality that this team has, that this program has right now, that they will take into this college football playoff. Not because these particular individual players are overlooked, but because as a school and a football program, this is a team that has come out of nowhere. Now, did they really come out of nowhere? We were put on notice when we saw all the activity in the portal. So to say they came out of nowhere, maybe that's not a fair assessment. But to say that they're not a typical team we see playing in late December and early January and into January, that's a fair statement. This is a team that is new to this party. But if you look at how they're doing it, right, it's the same way the Habs have been doing it forever. And they're doing it better because they understood exactly how they were going to do this. We've talked about it forever. Mining, like this football ops staff for Texas Tech is, I don't want to say it's something ridiculous, like just as prolific as the guys that they've recruited, but they have done a tremendous job to find talent all across the landscape of college football. So when you're ready to transfer, we're ready for you. One thing I don't love that's been going on, and Scotty put this on my radar earlier this morning, I had heard scuttlebutt about Brendan Sorsby going to the transfer portal. I think immediately him being thrust into the number one quarterback position. I saw that on CBS Sports, at least. That was like a ranking, right? Like, I don't know that I buy that, but I do buy that Texas Tech is all over him. And apparently that's where he wants to go, and that's where he's going to go. So it's like, I don't know what they're doing or how they're doing it, but to have a player be like, yeah, I'm going to leave Cincinnati and I'm going to Texas Tech, and that player be the number one rated quarterback in the transfer portal is all you need to know about this group going forward. And the Red Raiders spent a ton of money on coordinators in the offseason, right? We talked about Wood. And like, he's getting paid a ton of money. And that is almost, if not just as important as the talent that he is putting in places to succeed. That is a no-brainer there. Like, you have the X's and O's guys who can put guys in the position to succeed. And then you have, at the top of the food chain, the ultimate charismatic CEO, who is, by the way, one of Joey Maguire's secret weapons or superpowers, I guess superpowers, is that he is so comfortable and confident in who he is that turning over responsibility and not doing it in like a lazy fashion, like Barry Switzer coming back to coach the Cowboys to a Super Bowl, really like understanding delegation and allowing people to do what they're great at. Okay. Last point before we take a break and come back with Darren Smith, 42-10. And it's perfect to bring in Darren Smith after that, because that is the average score of a Texas Tech game this year. Texas Tech 42, opponent 10. Those are the kind of ass whoopings that some of these Miami Hurricane teams used to put on, right? When Darren was at Miami and they won 2 national championships with Dennis Erickson, right? Like, we're not going to just knock you down and win the ball game. We're going to embarrass you. I think they may embarrass their first round opponent. I mean, particularly if it's James Madison, but if it's Oregon, I really do. I think they will embarrass their first round opponent, and I think that will maybe let the rest of America catch up to the point where we already are. And I lied. One more thing. What's going on with this private equity stuff around college football, specifically the Big 12 and what we saw at Utah? That's because of BYU and Texas Tech. 100,000%. Like, it's really interesting, right? For a guy like BYU, for teams like BYU and Texas Tech, now you're in the catbird seat and other schools are chasing you, right? Really interesting stuff. All right, we'll get into more of the college football playoff later in the show, and also talk about the transfer portal. It's bananas. Next, we're going to talk to Darren Smith. We're talking about a guy who has not only cultivated an amazing championship pedigree himself in college and in the NFL, and done it at the most elite of levels, he's also now putting guys in position to go to the NFL as he coaches now down in Florida, and he's also ready for Miami, Texas A&M. We're back on the other side of this break with one of the members of the Bermuda Triangle, one of my favorite linebacking corps probably of all time, right? But we're also presented by Slovacek. We'll be back after that.